Back. Okay, Leanne, hit it.
All righty. I just want to say welcome everyone, and I'm so glad to see your faces and pictures and names on Zoom. First, I also want to say Valentine's Day is coming up, so happy Valentine's Day to you early. And just to remind you that, the gray whale's blow, when it comes up, it tends to form a heart shape, and that, of course, makes whale watching on a boat a great way to spend Valentine's Day. So get out there on the water and enjoy some whale watching. We've had incredible, it is gray whale season, and we've had incredible gray whale sightings. So I'd encourage everyone to get out there. Our March speaker is Dr. Yuna Ho, a professor and researcher with the School of Public Affairs at San Diego State University. And she's also a member of the California Ocean Protection Council's Science Advisory Team. And she's going to talk to us on March 8th about microplastics in the ocean and the historical disposal of DDT waste in the ocean and how it's affected the health of marine mammals. For this evening's presentation, if you have any questions, suggestions, or want to become, if you have any questions about anything ACS related or want to become a member, you can email us at acssandiego10.com. A quick reminder for tonight's presentation, please put any question
at gmail.com.
I'm sorry. That's correct. Yeah. ACS-Sandiego10 at Gmail, or as I heard on some show, Gmail, but gmail.com. And then a quick reminder for tonight's presentation, please put any questions that you might have for the presentation or for, any comments that you put those in the Zoom chat room, and we'll address those at the end of the presentation. And then that leaves us for tonight's speaker. He's an all-around great guy who's been a longtime friend and supporter of ACS. He studied biology and ecology of whales and dolphins for more than 35 years and is the current director of Marine Mammal and Turtle Division of the Marine Mammal and Turtle Division at Southwest Fisheries Science Center. So please give a warm welcome to Dave Weller. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for the kind introduction and welcome everybody. Nice to have you on board for an evening session. And yeah, the topic is on gray whales, and indeed they are going by our coast right now and their blows are heart-shaped. And so a Valentine's Day trip sounds like a great idea to take it all in. So this evening I wanted to talk to you a little bit about gray whales, but also it's a bit of a personal story of my lifetime of research on gray whales. And so it's going to be kind of a multi-pronged approach, some science, some personal story, and some adventure all woven together. And hopefully by the end, it'll be satisfying and you'll get something out of it. So why don't we go on to the next slide. When people ask me how long have you been studying whales, I can truthfully say my whole life. And this is a picture of me and my brother Sam back in 1972. You can go back one slide if you would, Rick. Back in 1972, watching gray whales off the coast of Malibu, California. And so while I was not collecting data in those days, I was formulating a future plan for my career at about 6 or 7 years old. We can go on to the next slide. This gives you a little bit of an idea about my education and academic pedigree, and I always feel obligated to say this because I wouldn't be where I am today without the people that are named on this slide. And these people were mentors to me that believed in me and helped me along my professional path and have become friends and are friends or were friends. And those include Dr. Lou Herman from the University of Hawaii, Dr. R.H. DeFran at San Diego State University, Dr. Bernd Wurzig at Texas A&M University, Bob Brownell, some of you may know Bob, he's a local Californian, and he was at NOAA in NIMS and invited me in as a postdoc. And I've been in residence at the Southwest Fisheries Science Center since 1998 in all different forms and capacities, postdoc, contractor, federal employee. And in the past few years, I've taken on the directorship of what's called the Marine Mammal and Turtle Division. We'll go on to the next slide. Just to give you an idea where we're at, it's a NOAA lab, it's a NOAA Science Center, and that red pinpoint is where the lab is located. If you look down on the left side out to the ocean, you can see the Scripps Pier. So it gives you an idea where our campus is, and it really is in the heart of the UCSD Scripps Institution of Oceanography campus. It's right on the horseshoe, if you will, as you go up the road. We're a laboratory of about 275 people, and we do all kinds of work, not only marine mammal and turtle work, but work in the Antarctic on krill, on fisheries, on ecology. So we're all over the map. And if you go to the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit about my own division. This gives you an idea. We're about 50 scientists in total. And we do all kinds of research on marine mammals. That includes whales, dolphins, porpoises, seals, and sea lions. And we also work extensively on turtles as well, the leatherback turtle in the Pacific on our shoreline here, an occasional visitor, not very common, but very important. It's a species in the spotlight. The population is struggling to survive. They migrate across the entire Pacific. So we've got an entire research group that work on leatherback turtles in the California, Oregon, Washington area. And we can go ahead from there. It gives you a little bit about me and my background and some of my mentors and friendships that I've formed over the years. And what I want to do now is to switch on to gray whales and the topic of our talk tonight. And this is an outline of where the talk is going to go. I'm going to start with a Pacific Basin-wide context. I want to introduce you a little bit to the costs of whaling, talk about my science and my staff science, and then a little bit on my lifetime adventure, which is centered in Russia. So we'll kind of go from top to bottom, and we can move along to the next slide. In terms of gray whale taxonomy, in the red circle there, that's the gray whale in comparison to all of the other cetaceans. And you can see if you compare it to the blue whale, which is the very top, the largest of the whales, a gray whale that's about 50 or 52 feet long is quite large for a gray whale. They're commonly in the 40-foot to 45-foot length, and a 52-footer is getting pretty big. Males and females grow to approximately the same size. And the unique thing about them is they have no dorsal fin. Like so many of the other whales do. They have what's called a dorsal hump, and it's followed by those crenulations or knuckles along the tailstock. And the great thing about gray whales is they're very uniquely modeled in color, and that allows us to learn and recognize individuals from photo identification studies. They're also bottom feeders, which makes them slightly unique. They can feed in the water column and on swarming organisms as well. They're relatively flexible and adaptable in terms of the prey they take, but really what they're mostly after are benthic amphipods that live in the bottom sediment. They go down, they suction along the bottom, and they pull those out of the mud and then filter it through their baleen plates. Let's go ahead to the next slide. In terms of population structure and definitions, there are two populations of gray whales recognized in the North Pacific, and the North Pacific is really the only place that gray whales exist any longer. They were hunted or became extinct in the Atlantic in about the 1700s sometime, although there are a few recent gray whale sightings in the past 10 years. One in the Mediterranean, and one off of Namibia in Africa, and another in Italy. And these are stray animals that are wandering from the Pacific into the Atlantic. So it's not impossible that the Atlantic could be recolonized over time as sea ice disappears and the northern passageways for access between the ocean basins starts to open up. But for now, we're talking specifically about the North Pacific. And there are two populations of gray whales in the North Pacific. One in the eastern North Pacific, that's along our shoreline here, is what we call the Eastern North Pacific, ENP. And the other is in the Western North Pacific. If you were to look out on the coast and go all the way across the Pacific to the other side, you'd eventually bump into Japan and Russia. And that's the Western North Pacific range for gray whales on that side. Next slide. Here's kind of the distribution of gray whales in the North Pacific. And let's start on the right-hand side with the red ellipse. And you see ENP, Eastern North Pacific gray whale. Their range is really from the Arctic Ocean up in the north at the very top of the map. That's where they summer and where they feed. So they're there from May, June, July, August, September, October, and November, feeding as much as possible. Come late November, early December, they begin their southward migration, which is happening right now. And they migrate from those cold Arctic waters that are very productive and food rich, where they fatten and recover from otherwise a long fast, about a 6-month fast. They migrate down through the Aleutian Islands, through the Gulf of Alaska, along the coast of North America. And at this time of the year, they're in relatively high numbers coming past the coastline of California. Some are already in Mexico and have been there since early December. But really, gray whales migrate between the north and the south. Most of them head down to the Mexican lagoons. They hang out there for a few weeks. They turn around and they head right back north, back up to the Arctic. The whales that do stay the longest in Mexico are the mothers with newborn calves. And they'll be residents there for a couple of months before they undertake the northward migration. If you go to the left side of the panel where it says WNP, Western North Pacific, in the green ellipse, that's where the other population makes a living. And they migrate from the Sea of Okhotsk up there in off the coast of Far East Russia and Sakhalin Island, down through the Sea of Japan, into the Yellow Sea, East China Sea, and probably winter somewhere in the off the South China Sea. Although that's a little bit of an enigma and a mystery to us right now as to where they overwinter. Whalers certainly were able to catch gray whales in the East China Sea and the South China Sea back in the day. But right now it's a little bit of a mystery as to where they go, and I'll tell you why in just a few slides. So let's go ahead and move along. Conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom can be used properly, and it can also be dangerous. And I just want you to remember the term conventional wisdom, because we're eventually going to circle back to that. And when we talk about conventional wisdom for gray whales, this is what we're talking about: the migration from the high latitudes in the summer to the lower latitudes in the winter. And those arrows show you what I just went through about the migration in the Eastern North Pacific from the Arctic to Mexico, and in the Western North Pacific from the far east of Russia in the Okhotsk Sea to somewhere off of Asia. In terms of the history of whaling, the gray whales have been were hunted for centuries by Aboriginal whalers. That top image there is of a macaw Indian whaler from the coast of Washington in Nia Bay off of Washington. That's the harpoon setup and the floats that they use for that very early Aboriginal whaling here on the coast of North America. In about 1846, the American Yankee whalers found the lagoons of Baja, and they just had a field day of essentially killing every gray whale that they could find, and did a very good job of that, unfortunately and sadly. In the 1850s, they started to creep their way up our coastline. Having hunted whales in Baja to almost none, they decided that they would move their way up the west coast. And even in San Diego Bay, there was a whaling station, and that's about the 1850s. And they started to diversify their hunt away from just gray whales to other species. By the late 19th century, gray whales were considered economically extinct. And what that means is it wasn't worth the energy for the whaling ships to go after gray whales anymore, because there were so few of them, and to find them and to secure them was not cost effective. So termed essentially economically extinct, and very close to being ecologically extinct as well on both sides of the Pacific. Fortunately, in 1946, the official protection by the International Whaling Commission, that's IWC, went into effect. And that is really kind of the saving grace for gray whales and a lot of the other large whales that we're so fond of and that have rebounded from near extinction. was through a uniform moratorium on whaling and official protection, allowing them to recover from the decimation of whaling. And one thing on this slide that I would go up to the second bullet point, and probably many of you have been to the lagoons in Baja where there are friendly gray whales. And it is just a fascinating bit of natural history that the very place that gray whales were slaughtered is now one of the only places where you can find a friendly gray whale. It's a complete 360-degree turnaround from decimation to friendly whales and a blue economy flourishing there and taking advantage of living whales rather than dead whales. So just wanted to add that as part of the history of whaling and part of what we've seen over the many hundreds of years now. Next slide, please. So the takeaway message, both populations in the Eastern North Pacific and the Western North Pacific were decimated by essentially commercial whaling. The Aboriginal whaling was not really responsible for driving the two populations to near extinction, but it was commercial whaling at a very high and rapid rate. The Eastern North Pacific population has recovered quite nicely and is considered a success story in terms of the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act. It now numbers about 20,000 whales in the Eastern North Pacific. The Western North Pacific population, however, remains endangered and numbers about 200 whales. So very different recovery paths that the two populations have been on. And part of that is because whaling continued to take place off of the coast of Asia into the late 1960s, where gray whales were still being taken despite the moratorium that I talked about in the IWC and international protection measures. So let's move along to the next slide. And what's going on with whaling today? There still is, gray whales are still whaled today. There's a very limited Aboriginal subsistence hunt that takes place off of Russia, off the coast of Chukotka. And there's a request to resume the hunt by the Makah Indian tribe of Washington, and that is currently in decision by NOAA as to whether they'll waive the law, which is the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which makes hunting any marine mammal illegal. They've asked for a waiver to that to resume their usual and accustomed hunting tradition on gray whales. Catch limits are set for those Aboriginal hunts, and they have been set since the 1970s. And it is really based upon scientific data and scientific advice, as well as a request need that comes from a government that is undertaking subsistence whaling. And for example, the subsistence whalers in Chukotka in Russia, they use the whales that they hunt, it's about 140 a year, for subsistence for themselves, to make it through the winter and to feed when they're not able to hunt other species of land mammals. So the quota for the Eastern North Pacific gray whales off of Chukotka is about 140 per year. That's sustainable. It meets all of the models that we've ever run in terms of how is the population doing and can it handle losing about 140 gray whales per year? And the answer is yes, it does not drive the population to decline. For Western North Pacific gray whales, however, there is no catch limit at the moment, it's 0, and that's because it's so small. Remember that 140 comes from about a population of 20,000, and even one whale from 200 is quite a different ratio in terms of impacts at the population level. So 0 for Western North Pacific gray whales, about 140 per year in the East. Let's go on to the next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit now about my gray whale research, and or when I say my, it's really our division and the great colleagues and scientists that work in the Marine Mammal and Turtle Division in La Jolla with me. And we can move right along to the next slide. We talked about the gray whale migration, and we take advantage of that migration to study them. And gray whales in the Eastern North Pacific migrate annually about 15 to 20,000 kilometers round trip from the Arctic down to Mexico. They touch the line, they turn around and they head back north and resume feeding again. All the while off of the coast of California, we're studying them as they're migrating south And that's one project that I'll tell you about in just a moment. And we also study them as they're migrating north, and that's a different project. They're both interrelated, but I'm going to describe those to you in the next couple of slides. Go ahead, please. This study is going on as we speak. We just finished another day. We assemble off of the northern coast of Big Sur at a NOAA research facility called Granite Canyon. That yellow arrow in the top photograph shows you the marine lab there, and it's a marine lab that does all kinds of science, ecotoxicology work on freshwater systems and marine systems. But we use it as our base camp to count gray whales as they're migrating from the Arctic, going south to Mexico. Down below, you can see that's a picture of me with binoculars, just like when I was 6 years old in the first photo I showed you, still doing the same thing today, almost 50 years later. We simply assemble, we set up a very small trailer. We've got tracking software, computer tracking software, and we use compass and reticle-based binoculars that we're hand holding there to count essentially every single gray whale that goes by our migration path, by the field site there. And what that is used for is to come up with an abundance estimate. And when I say abundance, if someone were to say, how many gray whales are there in the Eastern North Pacific? When you say there's 20,000, that comes from our science. It comes from the work we do to collect the data and then to model it. And it's not just a raw count of whales. We actually have these pretty elaborate models to adjust for and correct for poor weather conditions, nighttime passage rates when we can't be counting, inshore, offshore distribution differences and detection probabilities on how easy it is to see a gray whale that's 1 kilometer from shore versus 5 kilometers from shore. So there's a fair amount of math that goes into generating an abundance estimate. But those numbers that you're familiar with, I think all of you know that they're somewhere around 15,000 or 20,000 or 30,000 gray whales. That comes from the science that we do. And we do that almost annually with our team from La Jolla. We move up the coast essentially and set up shop there on the northern end of Big Sur. Next slide. In the spring, we do a similar study. It's a shore-based study using handheld binoculars. You can see the team down below sitting there at their observation table with handheld binoculars. And up above, this station is at the Pedras Blancas Light Station. It's a BLM property, which they're kind enough to allow us to move into for a couple of months every year from late March to early June. We live in the housing that used to be Coast Guard housing there. We live on site. And that middle photograph gives you a view. We're looking pretty much straight south down the coastline. And this study is to look at calf production. And so we set up the timing of the study to overlap when the mother calf pairs, the last ones to leave Mexico and the lagoons, when they're migrating north, we're there ready to count them. And the great thing about mother calf pairs is they hug the shore. It's easier for mothers to keep track of their calves. One, they've got a bottom and they've got a shoreline. So it's not just a wide blue expanse of very deep water. And it also allows them to be somewhat cryptic and avoid predation from killer whales and to have a little bit of an easier journey as they're headed from Mexico up to the feeding grounds with essentially newborn calves. They're only a couple of months old at this point. So we're there ready to count them. And so in addition to the abundance, how many gray whales are in the North Pacific, we also want to know how many calves are being born on an annual basis. And if we go to the next slide, I can show you some of the data that come out of these two studies. It seems a little bit busy, but it's not very busy at all. There are two panels, one on the top, number of gray whales, and one below, calves born annually. And that gray line gives you a sense on how many gray whales there are in the Eastern North Pacific. That's the abundance. And you can see that at about 2016, the abundance kind of reached its peak, right? It's the very highest part of that gray line. That was about 26,000 whales. It's come down since 2016 to 2022 to about 16,000 whales. So there's a decline there that has us interested. and aware. We're not necessarily concerned because you can see over time, the population abundance goes up, it comes down, it goes up, it comes down, it goes up, and it comes down. So essentially, we're on high alert now to keep track of what's happening with the abundance of gray whales in the eastern North Pacific. Because of that decline, I think that it'll probably start to stabilize and then show an increase again over time. But it may be a year, maybe 2 years, it may be 5 years from now. Associated with that decline in abundance has been what's called an unusual mortality event. It began in 2019. And what an unusual mortality event is when more whales are detected stranded and beached than the preceding 10 to 20 year average. And so indeed, we have more stranded gray whales 2019 through 2022 than we did the previous 20 years. However, in the past year, in this year, in the end of 2022 and this year, 2023, the numbers seem to be leveling off, and that the UME may be coming to an end here relatively soon. And that's when we would hope to see a recovery in population numbers. And the panel below, that comes from the calf count data from that second project that I described to you. And you can see that the calf counts are all over the map. Those blue bars indicate to you how many calves were born into the population in any given year. You can see in some years, 1,500 calves are born, and in other years, something on the order of 200. And that, again, it varies and it bounces all over the place. And part of what we've learned over time, and by looking at the Arctic environment where these whales feed, is that the Arctic plays a central role in the population dynamics of gray whales. And when they have access to proper feeding areas, when sea ice has retreated early enough that gray whales can feed for hundreds of days instead of 800 days, then the gray whales are going to do much better. Carrying capacity of the environment allows population growth and calves to be born. In years when sea ice is very stubborn and will not retreat, it's far down to the south, it excludes gray whales from the area they need to be to feed. And those are the years when we see population decline and number of calves starting to decline. So by counting gray whales and watching the calf productivity off the coast of California, we're actually studying the Arctic environment. And so they're sentinels of an environment that we never even visit and never even go to, but they're telling us a lot about the conditions there based simply upon numbers and calf production. So let's go to the next slide. We also, in addition to those shore-based counts, if you will, we also do photo identification work and biopsy sampling. And I'll just briefly tell you about both. The two upper panels are two uniquely marked gray whales. In fact, all gray whales are uniquely marked with that mottled coloration pattern. And if you can get a good picture of them, both of those whales are swimming to the right. You can see the dorsal hump followed by those dorsal knuckles that we talked about earlier. But it's that coloration pattern that allows us to identify them as unique individuals. So getting a good photograph's like getting a fingerprint of an individual. And we can track them and catalog them and understand individual level information as well as population level information. We do photo identification work from shore. There's a photo there of Dr. Amy Lang taking photos from shore. And a lot of that work is done from small boats. That's our team working off of the coast of Russia back in the early 2000s, collecting photo identification information. At the same time that we're taking photographs, we like to collect what's called a biopsy sample of these individuals. And in the very far right lower panel is the black is the skin of a gray whale and the pink is the blubber of a gray whale. And now keep in mind that gray whale blubber is like 12 inches thick. So this is a really small, tiny little plug of skin and blubber. We collect those by shooting a dart from a crossbow. In the top panel, you can see me with a crossbow. We shoot an arrow. In the center panel, you can see an arrow flying at the whale. It's got a little coring device which collects a piece of skin and a piece of blubber. Those tiny little samples are incredibly powerful in terms of what we can learn from them. From the skin, we can get individual identification, same as photo ID, but now we know them genetically. We can sex the individuals as to whether they're males or females. And we can look at relatedness between individuals, especially important is relatedness mother and calf pairs, but also kin relatedness and structure within the population. From the blubber, we can look at things like pregnancy through hormone analysis. We can look at contamination levels by a suite of bioassays to look at what types of chemicals bioaccumulate within their blubber. So that tiny little tissue combined with a photo of them is kind of the gold standard of what we're after for every individual in any given study. Let's go ahead on to the next slide. In the past 10 years, we've dedicated a lot of time to using drones, uncrewed aerial systems, if you will. There's an image of a tiny drone. They're really handheld at this point, quite small, handheld drone. And there on the right-hand side is our team just flying one, actually taking off. And that is headed out to take overhead images of mother calf gray whales at that Pedris Blancas light station that I described to you earlier. Let's go to the next slide. This is the kind of image we can get from those tiny handheld drones. And just like a biopsy sample, an image like this is really worth its weight in gold. This is a mother calf pair swimming north from Mexico to the Arctic, and it was taken there off of our field station where we collect calf production data. And so let's go on to the next slide and I'll tell you a little bit about what we can learn. Really what we're after is we'd like to know what the body condition of whales are. And body condition has a lot to do with how well they're feeding. And I told you that gray whales are sentinels for the Arctic environment. And when they feed well all summer, they are fat, and they should be fat because they need to use that fat for the entire migration, the wintering period, until they return to the summer feeding ground about a year later. When the feeding conditions are not good in the Arctic, whales are skinny, and we can pick up on that through photogrammetry. And in this example, on the left-hand side is a southbound gray whale, and you can see there's arrows measuring how long they are and then how fat they are essentially at the flippers. So this whale on the left is actually in quite good condition. It's a fat whale. As it should be, as they're headed south after feeding all summer. And from those same photographs, we can also determine pregnant females. And you can see the widest point on that photograph on the right is not at the insertion point of the flippers, right? It's to the rear. And the reason the widest point is there is because there's a fetus in there growing daily. And those mothers that are pregnant and soon to give birth are much fatter further back on their bodies. That can all be gleaned from these handheld drones and the overhead photographs that we take. Next slide. A couple more techniques for you that we use, satellite link tags. And on the right bottom panel, you can see there's a tiny little tag there in my colleague John Durbin's hand. We attach those tags to the dorsal hump of gray whales. In the left panel, you can see the same way that we take a biopsy sample with a dart. We apply the tags to the whales. The tags eventually fall off, but while they're attached, they're transmitting to satellites, and the satellites then come back with location information to our laptop computer. So essentially, we can follow gray whales from Mexico to the Arctic and learn about swim speeds, habitat use, intersections where they meet high densities of ship traffic or fisheries and nets. For example, we can start to get an idea about where hotspots of entanglement may be and hotspots of ship strike may be. And this is all from applying that tiny little tag and allowing the transmitter to transmit to space to the Argos satellite system, and then send us the data back to our laptop so we can follow them along. Let's go to the next slide and I'll show you an example of that. These are tracks that you can see, kind of the squiggly tracks all over the place, in different colors, represent different individuals. And there's two stories here on this slide. One on the left-hand side is the tracks of whales that we applied tags on in the Baja lagoons. And what we were most interested was how do they migrate through the LA basin, through the Southern California Bight. And the reason we were interested in that is because, as you know, there's a high level of shipping traffic in and out of the Los Angeles port, Long Beach port. And we wanted to know how gray whales interacted and or avoided those shipping lanes to try and get some information for management purposes. On the left-hand side, you can see the different colored tracks and how they came through the Southern California Bight. They all act slightly differently, but indeed they do intersect all of the shipping lanes at some point when they take that relatively coastal migration path. On the right-hand side, with the green land masses of Alaska and Russia and the photo above of a killer whale following a gray whale, these satellite tags were attached to killer whales. And what we were interested in is trying to figure out predation rates on gray whales by killer whales. We know that killer whales feed on gray whale calves in particular and attack adults as well. So these tags were put on in the Aleutian Islands, just somewhat near Kodiak Island in Alaska. And you can see the red dots there are the killer whales with tags on them. And the upper panel is before gray whales are migrating through that area as they head north back to the feeding area. The killer whales are kind of clumped around the Aleutian Islands, right? There's not a lot of red dots anywhere else. But when gray whales started to appear and are moving through the Aleutians and all the way up to the Arctic feeding grounds, you can see what the killer whales did. They started to follow them. And so there's a direct relationship between killer whales appearing in the Aleutian Islands, waiting for a known kind of funnel spot where gray whales migrate through. And once the migration hits that shoreline, they start to attack and follow and kill gray whales all the way up to the feeding grounds in the north. Next slide, please. So this part kind of takes me to my lifetime adventure, and it's a combination of science and adventure, hardship and joy. And it all really has taken place in Russia over the past 25 years. And now I would be remiss to say that Russia has a very different impression on me today following the war with Ukraine than it did back in the day when I was really active working there. It was in 1997 that we started, and Russia was wide open at the time. For the first time, ecologists and biologists were able to get into the country and start to study things that we wondered about for a very long time when it was under reign of the Soviet Union. And when that changed and we were allowed to get in the door of Russia, my target was gray whales in the Western North Pacific. We didn't even know if they existed at that time. This is 1997. The idea was, could they be extinct? Were they completely hunted out and gone? Or is there a possibility that we can still find them, study them, and learn something about the status of the population? So welcome to Russia was kind of the theme of my postdoc work beginning in 1997. Next slide. This is Bob Brownell, and Bob was the one that first asked me whether I wanted to go to Sakhalin Island. And Bob is a long-time senior scientist and marine mammal driver, a pioneer of the field, really, and incredibly well published, and depth of knowledge is just incredible if you know Bob or have had the good fortune to meet him and to work with him. He really is something else. But when he came to me and said, you want to go to Sakhalin Island, I've got a way for us to get in the door and start to learn about Western gray whales, I said yes. And away we went on what now is over a 25-year adventure. So let's keep going. Sakhalin Island, if you're not familiar with it, is you can see where that says Sea of Okhotsk in the yellow ellipse there, and the island just below the O of Okhotsk on the very northern section. That's where we went to study Western North Pacific gray whales. Good job on the pointer there, Rick. Thanks for doing that. So this whole adventure really took place there in the far east of Russia, in the very northeastern corner of Sakhalin Island. And let's keep going. When I wanted to know a little bit more about Sakhalin, people said, well, have you read Chekhov's account of the journey to Sakhalin? And I said, no. And when I did, the one quote that stood out to me was a quote you see here on the screen, which describes Sakhalin as hell, at least in Anton Chekhov's Journey to Sakhalin from 1890. I don't agree with that, actually. He may have agreed with it, and it probably may have been more like hell back in those days. But my time there was pretty special. It was not easy, but it was pretty special. And I'm going to show you some slides and tell you some stories now on that part of my life. Here's our field camp. So very different than working on the coast of Big Sur in Carmel and San Simeon, California. This is Sakhalin Island in the Russian Far East, and it is absolutely remote wilderness. There are no roads, there's no infrastructure, there's no Coast Guard to save you if your boat conks out. You're on your own. And this was something that was not completely new to me as a postdoc, leading a team into the field. But it's something that I grew accustomed to, that I am now thankful for, that we all made it in and out of there for so many field seasons without any real accidents happening, because there was no support. The important thing for me as a person and as a professional is you needed to be completely self-reliant. And there was never any question that came up or a problem that if we worked on it and worked on it and worked on it, we finally figured out a way to make it better. And that comes a lot from the Russians that we worked with. So just by context, this lagoon is what feeds the benthic organisms along shore there where gray whales feed. The yellow ellipse is a lighthouse where we lived, a Soviet era 1963 lighthouse. And we would go in and out of that lagoon. In Sakhalin, gray whales do not use the lagoon. They don't go into the interior margins of that lagoon, but they use the outer coastline along that barrier island there, where benthic biomass is fed from the effluent of that lagoon. The lagoon is critical to the ecology of the prey that gray whales feed on, and that's why gray whales assemble there. It really is a very unique ecosystem, relatively simple and relatively straightforward, but really important to gray whales. Next slide. This is kind of the beginning point of the adventure. That's the Mi-8 helicopter, military retired. It's the same helicopter you saw that Vladimir Putin's crew just crashed. It was in much better condition than the helicopters that we needed to use. But this is part of what I said, self-reliant. We would arrive to the Far East of Russia. We would meet a handful of Russian colleagues that were strangers when we began there and became friends and lifetime friends. They remain friends of mine to this very day. But together we worked as a team, about 4 Americans and 4 Russians in any given field season. We would get all of our gas, 55-gallon drums of gas, our outboard motors, our Zodiacs, all the food we needed, everything to be in the field in a remote area for 3 or 4 months at a time. And in the very early days, we had no satellite communications either. We were pretty much on our own. And that's something that changed over time. We were able to get onto satellite communications and have connections back home. But in the very early years, we really disappeared from the radar for a couple of months while we were gone and doing our thing. So next slide. This is it. This is our field camp. That's the 1963 lighthouse that you see there. The large masts that are in the tundra are radio towers. And then to the right is our living facility, in which was essentially a lighthouse keeper and his family, a spare bunkhouse that was in pretty bad disrepair that we renovated for our field team and as our research site. And then a large shed there that worked as the radio reception receiver area. And all the communications that we did have were by radio relay from one lighthouse to another on the island. Next slide. That's a picture of the living quarters. You can see that the winters there are very harsh and take a toll quite early on any structure. So they're always under repair. But one thing that I can point you to in this image that I'm quite proud of is that together, me and my team and our Russian colleagues built several outhouses, which I've never done again, and I probably never will. But the outhouse in the upper left corner in kind of that sandy patch there, you can actually see on Google Earth images. So we made our mark. It's still there. It's still being used. But it's one of those things that when you go into the field as a new PhD scientist ready to, engage in everything, you don't really think about the fact that you're going to have to dig an outhouse and maintain it and put a structure in place. But we did, and I find a sense of pride in that. But if you look around that camp, you can see there's nothing around it. It's all tundra for hundreds of kilometers in any direction around that camp, and that was pretty much our life there. Next slide. No electricity, no running water. So we collected wood, we cut it, we used it in combination with coal to heat the house, to cook our food. Our water came from a well. And this is a picture of somebody down in the well collecting a few buckets of water and passing them up to us as we looked down. It was always an adventure to go into the well because you never knew what you might find in the water itself. And I'll just leave that for another discussion at another time. But sometimes it wasn't crystal clear kind of water that you might want. So anyway, very hard conditions. And you can see in that picture, there are a few Americans there and a few Russians looking down into the well there. And I like to think about our time there together as really kind of being a reality TV show, in which what would you do if you put 4 Americans and 4 Russians together in complete wilderness and asked them to live there for 4 months under very hard conditions? That's pretty much what it was. But in our situation, in our reality television show, we became incredible friends, and we really worked through the issues of isolation and boredom sometimes when the weather was bad, and grew to love each other and become really fine comrades, as they would say in Russia. Next slide. We lived for the weather. This is sunrise, which is a little deceiving to this day when I'm looking out at the Pacific Ocean from the coast of California, north and south. It comes naturally, but I lived for a very long time where north and south were very different. They were the opposite directions, and the sun would come up over the ocean in the east and it would set in the west. So it was very unique, very special. But when the weather showed up like this, we were ready for it. And we worked from small boats, from Zodiacs that we would launch in the lagoon and take offshore to do our work. But those days were really cherished, and they weren't always that common. Next slide. This is more like the typical weather that you would find there in the Okhotsk Sea, this really stubborn fog. And our field seasons were a couple of months long, and one of them, we had 27 consecutive days of this kind of weather where you could not see beyond your nose. There was no taking a boat out to sea. There was no observations of whales from the lighthouse. So there were a lot of cards played and a lot of books read and a lot of naps taken. But we lived for the good weather. And when the bad weather came, we just persevered and tried to do our best to maintain our sanity. Next slide. Winter comes very early there. This is the 1st of September. So the boats needed to come up out of the lagoon. The outboards had to come into the house, into the kitchen, in fact, where the coal burning stove was, so they would not freeze up overnight. Otherwise, we'd be out of business. So the project only became harder as winter set in, and winter was very early. We wanted to stay until at least early October. So we needed to be able to persevere through these kinds of conditions, including maintaining our equipment in ways that I've never had to do since, warming and keeping outboard motors inside and warm so they would not freeze solid in the conditions. Next slide. The sunsets, the friendship, the times when the weather was great, the middle of summer, very short summer season, a couple of weeks at a time. But those were really special, and they resonate in my mind to this very day. This is a picture of me with a Russian colleague, Grisha Sadulko, and a Korean colleague, Hun-Yu Kim. And it was a multi-national program. We had Russians, we had Americans, we had Chinese, Koreans. We tried to really replicate where the gray whales lived in the Western North Pacific with scientists from those very range states in those very areas as well. It was really enriching and really fun. Next slide. We had a lot of great fun with our Russians. I learned how to play the accordion, or I played the accordion. I didn't learn how to play it, but I played it. We had a lot of fun parties. You know, when people would show up from the tundra, they'd ride in on motorcycles or on reindeer. And of course, bring bottles of beer and some vodka. And we had all kinds of fun parties in which we just got to know each other's cultures. They were so fascinated by Amerikanskis and everything we did in our language. And we were equally as fascinated with them as Russians and good friends. So it was really kind of a special experience of full immersion while doing science, full immersion in another culture. Next slide. I felt like after about, 10 or 11, 12 years there that I started to become a little more Russian. And when I look back at a photograph of my friend Alexei Yablokov, and then I look at a picture of what I was looking like back in the day, we kind of had the same beard. I didn't think I was Russian, but I was feeling more and more Russian all the time. Next slide. And then there were Russians that I think were starting to feel more and more American all the time. And on the left is me, taking a biopsy sample of a gray whale. And on the right is you know who, actually imitating me taking a biopsy of a gray whale in the Okhotsk. A weird coincidence and a weird circumstance. But sure enough, there you go, Vladimir Putin with his Mustang suit, crossbow, and trying to collect a biopsy from a gray whale. There were parallels there. We felt more Russian, and sometimes the Russians were feeling more American. Next slide. By the end of 4 months there, we were ready to get the heck out of there. And this book, Sakhalin Breakout, says it all. That's kind of how we felt. Just get us back to the mainland of Russia, get us on a plane and send us back to the US, please, because we'd like to flip a light switch and have the lights go on and not have to pump our own water and brush our teeth with filtered water from our canteens. So this book has always resonated with me, and it's really is truly the way that we felt by the end of each field season. But believe it or not, 9 out of 10 of us every single year would say, do you want to go back? And we were all yes, 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 yes. There was an occasional that said, no, thanks. Once is enough. I do not want to go back. But it was really quite an adventure, quite an experience. And the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit about what we learned while we were there. I told you when we started there in the mid-1990s, we really didn't know whether gray whales would be there in any numbers or whether they were extirpated and gone. So relatively quickly, in a matter of a few years, using photo identification, biopsy sampling, shore-based observations, we were able to say that, yes, indeed, there are gray whales here. They're here all summer, and this is where they feed. And to get them listed as critically endangered by the International Union for Conservation of Nature, which is IUCN. That was in 2000. By 2018, we had learned more about the population and watched it grow. Actually, from when we started, it was less than 100. And when we ended, that study's still going, but when our presence ended there, it was nearly double that size, about 200. So in 2018, it was downlisted from critically endangered to endangered. Population almost doubled, but only to 200, which is tiny. And it has shown this slow increase of about 4 to 5% over the past 20 years, which is hopeful. It's slow. We'd love to see it be a little bit higher than that, more like 6%, but it is increasing. There's about 50 reproductive females, and over time now, we've watched the first females that we met with their calves. We've watched their calves have calves, and we've watched their calves have calves. So multiple generations of females that we've known as individuals, and we now know their calves and have been able to follow them. And finally, the really important thing from a management standpoint is that using those biopsy samples, we were able to say convincingly that what gray whales in the Western North Pacific and in the Eastern North Pacific are genetically distinct from each other, both with DNA that they inherit from their mothers, but also with DNA that they inherit from both parents. So genetically separate populations. Next slide. So remember the conventional wisdom, right? Gray whales in the Western North Pacific stay in that purple ellipse and they move north and south along the coast of Asia and Russia. And in the Eastern North Pacific, they stay in that green ellipse and they move north and south between the Arctic and Baja. But I did mention early on that conventional wisdom can be dangerous. And this was the conventional wisdom all the way until about 2010. So within the past 10 years, conventional wisdom has actually fallen apart. And let's take a look at why. We know that whales that we were studying off of Sakhalin Island in the Akat Sea do migrate south to the coast of Asia. And we know that from these dead animals that wash up on beaches or are caught in fishing nets. And we know the individuals. So we've identified them off of Sakhalin. They've ended up off of Japan or China or other places. And we know who they are because we saw them in the summer off of Russia. And during the winter, they migrated south to the coast of Asia. Next slide. However, this is where conventional wisdom starts to fall apart. In 2010, Bruce Mate from Oregon State University and a number of us, together with Bruce and his team and our team, attached those tiny little satellite transmitters that I described to you earlier. We put some of those on gray whales from Sakhalin Island. And in the summer, in the Akat Sea, while they were feeding, and sure enough, of the tags that stayed on long enough, there were a handful that came all the way to the Eastern North Pacific. They migrated from Sakhalin to Mexico, across the Pacific Ocean. Nobody had ever thought that that was going to happen. In the left panel, you can see the tracks of those individuals. Each color is a different individual. And you can see they left Sakhalin Island, and at least one of them made it all the way to Mexico, turned around and made it all the way back to Sakhalin Island while transmitting its location via satellite. Just an incredible story. It really opened our eyes. And in combination with the satellite tagging, we had many, many more photographs of individuals. So I think those satellite tracks, it's 3 or 4 individuals, but we had hundreds of gray whales identified photographically. So when we compared those whales that were photographed individually off of Sakhalin to catalogs from the coast of North America, we found matches. And we continue to find matches today. We're up to about 40 or 50 individuals that show this cross-basin migration from the east to the west. But remember, we also have evidence that known gray whales from Sakhalin are staying in the Western North Pacific and going north-south off the coast of Asia. So we've got the same feeding group and the same feeding location off of Russia, but some animals going to the Eastern North Pacific and some staying in the Western North Pacific. 2 separate groups of animals doing different things. How did the genetic difference come up? How is it possible that for animals that seem to be using both sides of the Pacific, how can they be differentiated genetically the way that we were able to do that? And I can tell you why, at least in terms of our hypothesis. Selective breeding is that whales that are leaving Sakhalin Island, and you see in the right panel that little tiny purple arrow, that is the breeding season for gray whales. And so when whales leave Sakhalin Island, they're only off the coast of Kamchatka, Russia, when the peak of breeding is occurring. So they're most likely to be breeding with each other before they ever get to the Eastern North Pacific, where there are 20,000 other whales that have already bred as well. So they're breeding with each other before they meet the Eastern North Pacific population. They mix with them, they come back, but that is what allows the genetic signal to be present, despite the fact that we've got 2 groups that are mixing in one area during the summer. So next slide. This is kind of where it's left me after nearly 30 years of working on gray whales, scratching my head and kind of rubbing my beard, thinking about what have we learned? What do we know? And what's left to learn? Because right when we thought we had it all figured out and that, the conventional wisdom was truly the wisdom at hand, it all fell apart. And most fascinatingly, I mean, it's incredible. I love the fact that it has fallen apart because there are so many new questions to answer. There's so much new research to do, and it brings a whole new life to gray whales. We thought they were very mechanized in this north-south movement. You guys stay in the west, you guys stay in the east, and we got it all figured out. But no, we don't. Science is beautiful in that way, and it takes us on adventures and journeys and introduces us to things that we never would have thought of until we really put in the hard work and get out there in nature to try and understand what's going on. So thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation. And hopefully we've got some time that I can address some of your questions.
I will share some questions with you, and we had a pretty substantial number. So is there a correlation between late development of sea ice and a later southward bound migration? So the relationship between sea ice and migration timing.
Yeah, sea ice is it's retreating to the north, and so it's not nearly as extensive and coming nearly as far south as it had, in previous decades. And so there is actually, what we're finding from our count at Granite Canyon, that abundance count, is that we've seen something on the order of a 5 to 7 day delay in migratory timing. And it's likely due to the fact that whales can stay longer in the Arctic because they're not squeezed out by ice as early as they used to be.
So the next question is kind of related to that, is how important is the winter for recovery of the benthic amphipod population?
It's hugely important. And the entire, the drivers of the ecosystem and the cascade of nutrients that are dependent on sea ice is really important. And so with the disappearance of sea ice, there's an entire trickle down effect on the ecosystem all the way to the benthic biomass. So it's really important. Those changes in the Arctic are really important for population dynamics of gray whales and are likely to be that way for the coming decades.
Okay, and Troy is asking, and he's a whale watch operator, if you don't know Troy, but we are noticing fewer southbound gray whales this season, but more cow calves. And they all seem very healthy and well fed. Do you think the unusual mortality event is over now? Over?
Don't know if it's over yet. The trends, when we look at how many stranded gray whales there are by population size per capita, it's starting to normalize, and it's starting to look like we're back to normal conditions. Not quite yet, but soon. So I do think that the UME may be drawing to a close here within this year, hopefully. The lack of whales is in part due to the population decline. There's just fewer whales. 7 years ago or 8 years ago, there were almost double the number of gray whales, and the population has shrunk. It's declined. And I agree, we've seen from our count in Northern California, we've seen more mother-calf pairs this year than we traditionally do. So mothers are seemingly migrating slightly later and producing calves more to the north. They've always done that. But I do think that something is going on there. And until we have the data and we can really work through it, and maybe even years of data, no real conclusions, but it's kind of a gut feeling.
And Troy is sharing that last week he was in San Ignacio Lagoon, and there were noticeably fewer whales, but more healthy cow calves. So not really a question, but just share that.
Good to hear. Yeah.
Kay is asking, are there any future projections for climate change impacts to the breeding lagoons?
Let's see. No, not that I'm aware of, not yet.
Okay. And then Linda is asking, I saw some information that estimated the population after the latest UME, that the population was more like 16,000 versus 20,000. Thoughts?
Yeah, that's true. Our last abundance estimate was about 16 to 17,000.
Yeah. Okay. Do you use I think it's infrared. Do you use infrared devices for bad weather nighttime detection? What do you guys do at night?
We do.
Drink vodka and have a good time.
We do use infrared cameras to calibrate what we're missing at night. That's one thing, but also with the idea that it may be that we can automate some of these surveys from shore using infrared cameras. The results, when we've done some comparative of our visual observer counts paired with infrared cameras, the results are very promising. The cameras do a really good job at finding and detecting the thermal signal of a gray whale blow in their bodies, about on par with human observers. And the beauty of those cameras is they can run 24 hours a day and observers cannot. So we're on to that, and we've been working on it probably for the past 7 to 8 years, something like that.
Sweet. That's it. That's really interesting. What's your opinion about gray whales sleeping? You think they sleep?
They rest. Yeah, I think they're unihemispheric resters. So they'll rest one part of their brain at a time, one hemisphere at a time. And they need to stay conscious in order to breathe and to maintain some locomotion. They're never completely stationary. Occasionally you'll see one motionless on the surface, but generally they always have some fluke beats going. But I do think they can rest their brain in a way that we're not accustomed to as humans, but that other mammals have taken advantage of.
Okay, and then Ray wants to know then any numbers on how many gray whales are biopsied per year, what percentage of the population? And thank you for your presentation.
Yeah, so
any idea how many biopsies you're able to get?
it depends on what your question is and why you're collecting them. But I would say on the coast of California, Oregon, and Washington, it's probably something on the order of 70 biopsies per year. Our work in Sakhalin, we were very vested in trying to get a biopsy from all the individuals. So we had, I think, something on the order of 85% of all known individuals were also biopsy sampled.
Wow, that's awesome. It'd be awesome to try to then really get after the ones that you were lacking. You know, that there's a lot of work in trying to do that.
Yeah.
Carl is asking, we see some gray whale births en route to Mexico. Any idea of the survival rate for those offspring?
No, we don't know. And, you know, I think the hypothesis as to why gray whales migrate, you know, there are two kind of competing hypotheses. One is to avoid predation pressure, to avoid killer whales, and killer whales are certainly much more numerous in northern climates. And so once they get to California, there are still killer whales around, but the numbers are much reduced. And as they make their way through California to Mexico, they become even fewer. So I would imagine that the calves probably are quite likely to survive. And the other hypothesis is thermoregulation, and that it's just a much friendlier environment to be nursing and to be raising a calf and allowing it to grow. But I think the timing that it takes them to get from California, San Diego, to Mexico is not very long at all, and the conditions are not too dissimilar. So I think they have a really good chance of surviving.
Yeah, good. Thank you. And then Anna says, building on Carla's question, which was the last question, do you know the survival rate of juvenile and adult gray whales?
Yeah, it's well, we even know it for 1-year-olds, and the adult survivorship is about 98%. It's very high. And that's kind of the same for so many of the large whale species. And for the calves, it's somewhere on the order of 68 to 70%. So higher calf mortality, but once they get to be 1-year-olds, 2-year-old, 3-year-olds, the survival rate goes up.
Okay, thank you. Jane wants to know, do you know if there are any female gray whales that traveled across the Pacific to the lagoons of Mexico?
Yes, there are.
So everybody's in for a good time in Mexico. All right. Marissa is asking, it might be George actually, what is the maximum depth gray whales can effectively feed? Is this depth limitation a significant limitation on feeding grounds and the population?
It's only a limitation if their prey is in water that exceeds their dive capability. And as far as we know, the benthic prey base that they specialize on is well within reach of how deep they can dive, but they'll be foraging in 90 meters of water in the Arctic, something on that. And I would imagine that they can probably go deeper, but they may not need to because the prey is dependent upon an ice shelf and a relatively coastal environment. So I don't think that their benthic prey is occurring in really deep water, so there may be no need for them to feed. But they'll also, like in Sakhalin, we'll see them feeding in 3 meters of water. It's incredibly shallow. It's almost as if they're standing on their head when they're doing that.
Tracy is asking, and she's taken back by the arrows. So did you say you shot an arrow with tracker on it like you do for the biopsies? So I guess it's how do you place the satellite tracker, I think, on the whales, and are you using the crossbow to do that? I think that's what Tracy's asking.
Yeah, it's the same device, same delivery system. And so instead of an arrow on the end of an arrow, it's modified. So if you take a biopsy, there's a coring device that screws onto the end of it, and that collects a biopsy and a piece of skin, hits the whale, then it rebounds and bounces back out, and it floats on the surface of the water. Same thing with the tags. You modify the end of the dart. So the tag goes, it's got a very small prong on it that goes into the skin, into the blubber, and it serves as an anchor to hold the tag. And then the arrow bounces back out, floats on the water, and you go over and collect it.
And then Scotty asked, do we see eastern whales in the West?
Well,
yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
It depends on your definition, but we have those whales that I told you about that we've seen in both. So are they Western gray whales that are in the East, or are they Eastern gray whales that are in the West? We don't have the answer for it.
Okay, so they're going across. Celine is asking, when does benthic foraging become more efficient than the giant gulps, especially when going trans-Pacific?
They're not.
Think they feed?
I think they snack along the way. If they can find some food, they'll certainly take a mouthful and snack along the way. They're not feeding extensively, however. And gray whales morphologically, they've not evolved to be gulp feeders. They don't have the same kind of gular grooves. They have a few, but they just don't have the apparatus, the baleen or the throat and the mouth in order to be engulfing feeders. They can skim occasionally, but they're not well suited for it. They're much better to be what is the whalers used to call clam diggers, rooting in the bottom and using a suction mechanism to get amphipods out of the mud.
And I've personally seen off of Point Loma, and it's been photographed where they're munching on kelp. But do you think that's just sort of having fun playing as they go through?
I do. Yeah.
Not nutritionally significant, I would imagine. Okay, we just got a couple more questions. You're doing great. You're out. Sure. Your PhD committee is about ready to go talk about you.
Okay.
Ray says that are there any groups using drones to collect the blow of for cellular debris to be used for molecular studies?
Yes.
I guess that's like the SnotBot.
SnotBot and other groups are doing the same thing. You can learn about the microbiomes of the respiratory passageways from collecting blow. You can also get hormones from the same samples to look at reproductive and nutritional condition of animals. So yes, research groups around the world on many different species are using that technology.
And I got two more questions for you, then we'll let you go here. But you mentioned a contaminant study. What sorts of contaminants are being detected in your biopsies?
Yeah, it's mostly for the large whales. It seems to be metals rather than kind of the lipophilic contaminants, which, by the way, your next speaker, Dr. Ho from SDSU, is a friend and a colleague of mine. And together we've worked on looking at contaminant levels in bottlenose dolphins from Southern California, from San Diego County. So she'll give a dynamite presentation. You guys should all be there and look forward to that because she'll do really well. But gray whales are a bit different than some of the odontocetes in that they don't seem to bioaccumulate contaminants at the same rate that the toothed whales do.
And I just wanted to, I got one more question, but I just wanted to tell you, Dave, that you've attracted an audience from Washington State, from Oregon. I recognize a number of names. I'm going to miss other places that people are from, but you are an international draw, and we are very, very grateful to you. And the last question goes to our national president, Uko, who you know, and he is asking, is any research continue to be done by the Russians off of the island?
Yes, amazingly, despite the
He
war.
actually wrote the island. I can't pronounce it.
Sakhalin Island. Yeah, despite the war and the close down on foreign scientists, we worked very hard to build the capacity within Russia for the scientists to take on the project and do it themselves. And that has paid off incredibly, because there's no way that we would ever get permission or be allowed to go there to work. But those scientists that we worked with for so many years and built the capacity to hand it over to them, they're still there doing it. It's amazing to me that they're able to pull it off and continue to get the information. So yes, I think the study is going into, it started in 1997 and it carried on last summer and will again this coming summer as well.
That's awesome. That, you know, first off, unbelievable for what you and all the other scientists endured, and I was incredibly impressed by, as a really low level biologist compared to you, of the fact that there were a significant number of women involved in that research as well, in those harsh conditions. So cross-gender biology, awesome. That, I think that's really, really cool. For everybody watching, this is being recorded and I will have it up on our YouTube channel probably sometime this weekend. And again, I personally, but as I throw it back to Leanne, I personally want to thank you once again, Dave. It's always interesting. So thank you for sharing your time and expertise. Back to you,
My pleasure.
Leanne.
Yep. My
Yes,
pleasure.
thank you very much, Dave. I really appreciate you coming to talk to us, and it's always great. And those little things that keep you going, like those outhouses.
Yes, indeed. Well, what you guys do
you.
is what ACS does is very important, and I want to
thank you.
I want to thank you guys as well, because as scientists we do our best to reach out to the public and share our message. But ACS and groups like ACS do a terrific job of reaching into the public, getting people excited about nature. And when they get excited about nature, they become curious about science. So it really is a full circle, and it's beneficial for us to learn from you and to be part of your group and part of your community. So anytime that you need a speaker or somebody to offer an answer to a question, just reach out. Happy to do it.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Yeah, a great job as always. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
And then if anyone has any questions or any ideas for presentations, you can email us at acssandiego10@gmail.com. Thank you again. Good night, everyone.